Welcome, everyone, to another very special episode of Legends and Lectures. I'm here with the legendary Dr. Jonah Siegel, whose mom I know and whom I begged to please let me interview him because he has many, many books about subjects that we need to talk about. Specifically today, the emergence of the modern museum. So, Dr. Siegel, would you please introduce yourself for those who don't know you?
Yes, well, you can call me Jonah to start with, of course. So my name is Jonah Siegel. I'm a professor in the Department of English Literature in Literatures in English, I think so we call it now, at uh, Rutgers University, which is the State University of New Jersey, on top of many other things. And I've worked for years on writings on art, the relationship between art, literature, and its institutions, and the sort of back and forth between foundational ideas going back to the 18th century or even earlier in some cases, and contemporary thoughts and even feelings about institutions of culture. So I'm interested in continuities between things that people often think are very separate, like high culture and low culture, Victorianism and modernism, Victorianism or the Victorian period, I should say, the 19th century, and the contemporary world. And this has led me to write, as you said, more than my share of books about these topics. And actually, recently, I've just started a Substack where I'm slowly
Yes.
walking through the European painting collection or the European painting galleries at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They a couple of years ago now they rehung the part of the collection that's early, 1300 to 1800, in a very interesting sort of quietly radical, I think, way, and just very interesting in a number of ways. And so I realized. A little while back that I wanted to reflect on what they had done because there's a lot of discussion in museological circles about how to make a museum these days, how to deal with older art, what's the relationship between contemporary culture and the past, and there are unsurprisingly, there are more and less compelling ways of responding to that, both in the written word and in actual museum practices. It struck me that what the Met had done was particularly interesting. And yeah, also for personal reasons, I wanted to have a project that involved really focused attention to one thing. So very slowly and with some system, I walked through every room. I looked at everything as much as you can in a museum. By which I mean I looked at as many of the paintings as I could. I read all the labels that I could. I looked also at the juxtapositions of works of art, the juxtapositions of rooms you could see and corners of rooms you could see. And I try to think about how that set of galleries work together. So that's one of the projects I've been working on lately that speaks a little bit to my interest, which are both these intellectual ones I've described, and I'm also quite interested in figuring out ways of getting some of the conversations that often take place at fairly rarefied levels into a more general sphere. The museum's a perfect place to do that because it's a place where that's shaped by ideas all the time, but it can be encountered by anybody. It's a kind of public sphere. So that's what hear your questions. But I'm also in the middle of finishing, if that's the way to put it. I'm finishing a kind of scholarly, semi-scholarly book on that started out being really about fantasies of the destruction of museums in contemporary culture. I noticed there were a lot of just like streaming media, what we used to call television shows, films, that for no particular plot reason showed museums being totally obliterated or damaged or injured in various ways. I became fascinated by that. And so I'm working on a project that's currently called The Sadness of Curators, that's about contemporary cultural relationships to the museum and their history and why we feel the way we do about museums. And I'm advancing with a kind of peculiar thesis. I'm proposing that the current um, sometimes antipathy, sometimes probably more ambivalence about museums that we sometimes think is a radical position based on our sense that we want to leave the past behind. I think that, in fact, our kind of anxieties about museums or our resistances to museums or sense that they should be taken apart or they cause some harm or something like that are not unrelated to an anxiety about the future. So it's not that we, like the futurists in the early 20th century, really were making the claim that the modern world needed to destroy museums, move forward, the car, the airplane, speed, futurity. We were going forward to something, and they wanted to be there. Um, I think current fantasies about injury to museums tend to be much less about a kind of utopian, frantic desire to get to the future, and more about an anxiety about that future.
Absolutely, especially I think whenever you look at how fascism is portrayed, they're always smashing the museums. They don't want people
Mm,
to know about the past, right? So especially since unfortunately that those themes have come back into fashion,
mm,
you'll see a lot of people trying to say, "Oh no, this is how it is." Even when recently, I know someone who went to the Alcazar in Spain, and so I was there almost 20 years ago. And recently he told me that even though the current government is not too bad, they revamped it to remove a lot of the art from a certain background. And I thought that was very interesting that even though that region is part of Al-Andalus, they decided to remove a lot from the Arabic period and put in more of things that happened during the 1920s. So again, it's a choice.
mm.
And so I thought it was very interesting.
Oh, it's interesting you say that. I mean, there's two things I'd like to amplify. I mean, a lot of times fascists make museums,
Hmm.
and certainly, our president, our current president in the States, maybe it'll be over by the time anybody's seeing this video, but our current president in the United States wants to make I think, a park full of our heroic figures, and so that's going to be a certain kind of museum. Um, Mussolini was responsible for developing a part of Rome called EUR, and which is has very cool, really kind of fascinating fascist architecture. People generally see it in movies. It's often used in like science fiction
Hmm.
movies. It's so cool. And in that, there's, for example, the Museum of Roman Civilization, where they try to capture the glory of ancient Rome in order to valorize what fascism was in some ways. And um, generally speaking, Mussolini is a good example of the complicated relationship between politics and museological practices. I mean, um, he was responsible for a lot of digging in the Forum. I mean, if you or your viewers have been to Rome, you probably wandered, stumbled in a puzzled way through through the Forum, this central part of ancient Rome that's largely in fragments. What's hard to imagine for us is that through most of the periods that I study, in earlier periods, um, that stuff was about 30 meters underground. That is to say, starting in the 19th century, they started to excavate quite a bit. And when you're excavating in a place with real history like Rome, and this goes back to the question, the point you're making about Spain. They're real decisions about what history you want to talk about, and they're always going to be somewhat tendentious. So they wanted to get to the level of imperial Rome, and I think they believed they did, and they just kept digging and digging and digging. But it's a kind of decision because there's many layers, and in order to get to that level, they had to destroy what. Certainly by North American standards and even by European standards would be a lot of other history, a lot of that part of the Forum. It wasn't just that a lot of it had a lot of dirt had entered the area and had silted up, but they'd also built houses over it. It was a very developed medieval and Renaissance area, and they just tore that stuff down. So in order to find the history that they wanted, they had to get rid of the history that they weren't interested in. And it wasn't just like, oh, we hate these or those people, but they wanted the real past and that real past coincidentally was connected to a future they were hoping to imagine for themselves, a kind of vision of Italy as allied to the Roman Empire. Now, I'll remind you all that Italy basically is a very young country. It's much
Yes.
younger than the United States, in some ways than Canada, I suppose, right? It unified, I think, in the 1860s, and so. And it really, I mean, and still to this day, it's a very, very regional place. And so the idea that Italy was sort of the Roman Empire in some ways, okay, that's fine, but it's not, it's a political decision. It's not necessarily what the Venetians might be thinking about, or the Sicilians or something like that. So anyway, so that's a political project. About Spain, it's interesting what you're saying. I mean, I was just in Andalusia a couple of weeks ago,
Oh yeah, that's
and
right.
there wasn't I didn't there was a real I didn't see a lot of like censoring of the kind of Islamic periods. I did. I mean, I've been in and out of Spain for a lot of my adult life, and the last time I was there, maybe 20 years ago, was right after 9/11. Um, it was clear that Spain was really working hard to reconcile with its past,
Mm.
or to engage with its past, or come to terms with its past. That past, which includes, of course, I mean, all kinds of interestingly troubling moments. Famously the expulsion of the Muslims and Jews in 1492, and also, of course, the beginning of the imperial exploitation of Latin America. But in the areas of and the Caribbean, the areas of Andalusia that we were in, it was particularly notable that they really were like memorializing and remembering. Jews and Muslims more than in the past. So I didn't notice that much of it going away. And just to finish this long cycle of a response to your comment, I think, rather this is the case with Mussolini in Rome. Um, when you're trying to really make a historical, um, when you're trying to bring back a site to some kind of historical period, all of the most interesting sites have more than one historical period you can talk about and valorize. And Europe, in that sense, and a lot of the world, is really a palimpsest. And the question of which part of the manuscript you're going to try to like make visible, the what part of the rubbed out and written over and rubbed out and written over palimpsest you want to recover, is always a cultural decision, and brings a lot of repercussions in its tail. And sometimes it's just impossible. And famously, Freud said, when he was trying to describe the unconscious, he described the unconscious as being like Rome. And what he meant by that was that you couldn't actually reconstruct, or like that it all existed on top of itself, and it was impossible to separate it all out. He didn't mean just that you should excavate it or something like that, but that it's. I use the metaphor of a palimpsest. A palimpsest is a flat thing, and someone has erased the whatever, the lambskin, and written over it again because it was so precious. The new manuscript goes there, but you can see underneath it the earlier text. That's simple compared to what you get in a place like Rome, or a lot of other places where there's one sacred monument, and on top of it they've built another sacred monument, or possibly, as in Rome, it was an apartment building, and then there's a Mithraic temple in the apartment building, another Mithraic temple. They built a church in, I don't know, the 6th century, but then it was knocked down, and they built another one in the 14th century, and then they repainted it in the 16th century, and then they added this really interesting mosaic in the 18th, but then it was decided in the 19th that interesting mosaic and all that Baroque decoration was kind of gross, so they ripped it out. When you want to show the historic truth of the structure, what are you going to do? You really have to make a set of decisions. So I'm a little bit more sympathetic than some people are to, like, you might be, like, as your friend found, you might be talking more about 1920s at a given moment, or because it really is difficult to tell the truth about the historical existence of anything complicated. So like the unconscious has many things, going on inside it, and you can't get to like an original one in any real way. You just have to like process and figure out your relationship to that mess. Similarly, the same is true of any important historical site, with the difference being that the museum keeper, the site keeper, the archaeologist has to make some decisions about what they're going to show the public on any given day, right? So it's an interesting challenge, and you do see in recent years, museological practices and architectural restoration practices trying to honor these differences. So you'll go to I don't know, a church in Italy, and they might have exposed a section of the much earlier medieval fresco, but they haven't, for that reason, not destroyed the entirety of a wall that was put in, in a later period.
And so would you say that the purpose then of a museum is to tell a story?
Well, I'm happy when museums tell stories, and this is where I'm an English professor, not an art historian. I'm a big believer in stories, and by that I mean I don't believe that stories are true in any kind of boring way. I just think we're always telling stories, and it's not a bad thing to structure a museum to tell a story. It will be a story, right? So it's very difficult to make a museum that in some way doesn't tell some kind of story. But that presents a lot of challenges to the viewer, right? Why are you looking at this thing if there's no reason to look at it? Your probably two of your extreme alternatives are go to this space because this is the space where you have significant experiences, but we're not going to tell you why those experiences are significant. And you just have to be sensitive enough to recognize what matters and why it matters. So that's a one like extreme sort of like the school of absolute experience of the museum. Don't give me a guidebook. Don't tell me anything about history. I'm just going to look and see what means something to me, right? So that's one extreme. The other extreme is we go to museums to learn stuff. Let's methodically learn about the history of art or the history of human species, or I'm always thinking about art museums, but I have to acknowledge there's other kinds of the history of the discovery of the atom or the current state of the research into the atom or the history of electricity or so on. So so there's two broad extremes, and I think for a long time in sort of popular culture, the kind of just go in there and have your experience and have your feelings model has really predominated. And I was kind of raised in with that sensibility a little bit, but I'm not sure it's always the best, and it's often kind of a little bit class based. It's sort of like you've learned stuff, but we're just going to pretend you haven't learned that stuff and pretend that it's natural to you to have these responses, right? So there's that on the one side, there's that, and on the other side, there's the attempt to tell fairly simple stories that make people happy. And I'm not just talking about like things that we find politically suspect now, but I'll give you a good example of a museum that tried to tell a story for a long time, the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. So that that was really built to tell the classic story of the rise of modernism as this kind of heroic movement leaving behind the past in various ways, a story of like a bunch of, I think, almost entirely men doing incredible things and moving away from a past that wasn't of no that was no good anymore, or something like that, or that wasn't inadequate to our modernity because it's so complex. Our lives today are so complex when apparently in the past they were simple. So um, that story has been questioned by endless number of art historians, and from various angles. I mean, it's just simply historically not true, but it also leaves out all kinds of peoples. So the Museum of Modern Art, which is really designed to tell the story, and it did a good job telling it, and it's a good story. I mean, it's kind of cheering and heroic and so on. They've had to sort of reorganize themselves over the last maybe 20, 30 years, and they've had to make it a museum that doesn't tell one story anymore, right? So. Um, I do think both. So you asked me, do something like do museums tell stories or something like that. I think I think they generally do. I think I like museums that try to tell a story. But as what I do as a professor of literature is to teach people how to read stories. And when I teach them how to read stories, I'm not teaching them to just slavishly, this is how it began, this is the middle, this is the end, and that's the true story. That's all that matters because you just read it. Obviously, putting oneself in relationship to a thoughtful relationship to a story somebody tries to tell you is part of being a kind of an ethical thinking being. And so I'm happy to have a little dialectic between the stories the museums try to tell or the many stories they provoke and individuals really wrestling with those stories, bringing them home to themselves, seeing how bring them to the court of their own personal judgment, their own experience. So, so there's a couple of things I want to say about this. One is I do think I was chatting recently with somebody else about museum visiting, and um, I was saying one of the things that we have to do when we're thinking about visiting a museum or a site, and it's sort of on the one hand, it's going to sound like I'm talking about a kind of privilege, but I'm really it's really not. I think it's very important when you're visiting anywhere important to think you're going to go back. I've been thinking about this lately. If you think, because it's a thought I've had in the past that one of the problems with museum visiting is people tend to treat it as a spectacle rather than as like going to something like a park or something like that, So they it's sort of time bound and so on. Um, and so one way of escaping this is to say to yourself, I will be back, or like we did, I'm literally going to be back in 20 minutes because I'm not going to just follow when this ends, I'm going to go back and use the knowledge I had to reflect further or to have further feelings. So I think it means obviously, I mean, I've certainly reached the age where I can't pretend to myself I'll always be back anywhere. Every once in a while, I do have the poignant feeling that this might be the last time I'm seeing this or that thing. But I think even now, I'm telling myself, I'm starting to think about telling myself, no, no, I'll be back. I will return to this thing, and obviously I'll return to it in memory. I just think that and so this is you're talking about this issue in relation to like why you don't wouldn't want to go on a tour that rushes you through things. That makes tons of sense. But I actually think people are often being rushed through by their own internal sense. Like I'm
Mm.
visiting, I'm at the Louvre, I'm in Paris for 4 days. This is my one morning at the Louvre because I didn't talk to Jonah before going, and he didn't tell me I should go at least 2 or 3 times to the Louvre so I don't go crazy. Yeah, that's what you should do. Any major museum, if you really care about art, any major museum you're visiting in any major city, you should actually schedule a couple of visits. Put that into your plan. Maybe skip some other site. I'm saying this not because that's the only way you're going to see more of it. I'm actually saying it because each one of the visits will be better because it's not a giant rush, right? And the idea of returning really helps. There was recently we just closed a big exhibition at the Met of Raphael.
Mm.
And it was a fantastic exhibition of really unbelievable drawings. It was really, I mean, I've never been a huge Raphael fan, but this was seeing his drawings was just, it was moving in any number of ways, which I could tell you about later. But the main point is it was incredibly crowded. Um, and that put a real pressure on how much time I felt I could spend. So it's not just tours that make you feel this way. Uh, I just went back the next morning and and they were still crowded, but I was seeing again objects that I had seen the previous day. I also went a bit further. It also meant I didn't exhaust myself looking at the things at the end. So I think, I think the idea of returning is a good one. So I'm just belaboring a point that's related to your sense of what the tour guides, uh, 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 do and don't give you. I mean, I think what we all fear is if this is Tuesday, this must be Florence kind of tour, right? Just making you pretend that you've seen stuff. And I've been in enough major sites that I've seen tours just lie to their. I remember years ago we were at one of the cities of Pompeii, where there's the famous Villa of the Mysteries, and the guide. It might have been just been a school teacher, but it was definitely a guide of a group of people, and they were trying to find a painting. It's called La Flagellation. I mean, it's somebody being it's the Villa of the Mysteries is very strange. These were these Roman mysteries that cults
Hmm.
that we don't really understand that well what they did because they were somewhat secret. They were kind of developments in late antiquity where Roman culture got very funky and actually had a lot of Eastern influences, kind of 1960s sort of thing. Anyway, they had these mystery cults where people got together and did peculiar things, and this one involved someone being like a woman actually being beaten in some way. I mean, ritually, I don't know, I don't know how serious it was. Anyway, so when you see it, you actually see, oh, there's a woman being beaten, but the tour guide's like, oh, and over there is the flagellation. She pointed out, I don't know, some pictures of some sheep or something like that. It was not the flagellation. So yeah, so you can easily be misguided by your guides. On the other hand, you can also be misguided, of course, by your own sense of your own sensibility. And as I mentioned this in an earlier conversation I was having on this, the most amusing person on the subject is E.M. Forster, who, if you read, I think it's a Room with a View. he's got a very funny chapter called "In Santa Croce Without a Baedeker," which is all about like trying to see a complex cultural site without knowing really what you're doing, and things ensue. Let us just say.
When actually did the word museum? Because we could say, so I could say my house is a museum of
Hmm.
me. I could say that these are my cultural artifacts and this is
Hmm.
my museum. So when did this word museum begin to be applied to things that are things that people would want to come and experience?
Right. Well, so museum, I think I say this in that, maybe I say this in the book that you're displaying there in the Emergence of the Modern Museum. I can't remember, but I've certainly said it in some of my writing. The museum is a kind of an old sounding term for a relatively modern invention. I mean, this is related to my arguments in the book I'm working on, where I'm suggesting that the antipathy towards the museum has to do with a fear of the future, not a disgust at the past. So, um, the idea that you should put a whole bunch of stuff together to be looked at by a public for its edification requires a whole bunch of things to be true. I mean, among them, the modern idea of the public, which is also fairly recent.
Hmm.
Um, so when we say the 19th century is the great period of museum building, that's like saying the 19th century is the great period of laying of train lines.
Hmm.
It's not because they had different or fewer train lines in the 18th century and earlier. They didn't have train lines in the 18th century earlier. So the modern museum is typically dated, certainly the modern art museum is typically dated to the founding of the Louvre. I mean, there's definitely some antecedents to a certain extent in England and in Italy, but the public museum, as we understand it today, the public art museum, as we understand it today, really has its roots in the revolutionary period. And from my point of view, I know whatever your viewers might have a different sense of temporality, but the French Revolution is the beginning of the modern world in many ways. It's when we in this case, not my not putative ethnic background, but we as people decided that we could make our own destinies and we could get rid of our leaders and make our lives anew. And there was a lot of stuff that had to be redesigned. And among the things that emerged was the modern idea of the museum. There were definitely collections of fascinating stuff before the Louvre. I mean, they were museums sort of like in Rome and a few things in England, but and elsewhere. But the typical thing you had in earlier periods was what we call a cabinet of curiosities. So your home, my guess, would probably have the characteristics of a cabinet of curiosities. I have not seen your home, but I'm going to make a stab in the dark, which is to say, a collection of intriguing objects, both of natural history, so plants and animals, shells. Maybe they had, fast. I mean, really old. I love old cabinets of curiosities. They might have. They used to think that thunder created certain kinds of stones. So they had like
Yes.
thunderstones, things that
Yeah.
we don't believe exists anymore. Or I mean, I guess maybe they don't exist. Or maybe a curious a curious stick that kind of looks like a snake, or all kinds of, or the horn of a unicorn. That's like an interesting one because it might be a narwhal horn or something like that. So it actually would be a real rarity. I mean, there weren't that many narwhals and to be found, but it's not a unicorn horn. Anyway, so you'd have that and maybe and some beautiful paintings, maybe some tapestries, uh, s- maybe some stuffed object from some imperial exploration or trade actually in these periods, which are often before like the golden age of imperial expansion, or the maybe it's not a golden age, but the period of imperial expansion. Anyway, so when you see prints of these things, they're just fascinating to look at, and when you get lists of them, they're just really thought-provoking. And they really speak to the idea that people want to marvel, like they're cabinets of curiosities, right? Or in the German term Wunderkammer, like rooms of wonders, right? And I think people want that. I don't think we've lost the desire to be amazed by things, and the amazing things can be both, oh my God, look how beautiful this thing nature made is, or wow, how weird my fellow people are. I mean, they really wrote the entire Bible on a grain of rice, and I can see it through this magnifying glass. And look how cool is a magnifying glass, or whatever it might be. So in the past, you had Wunderkammer, and on the one hand, they're characterized by the heterogeneity of their holdings, so a variety of things. And the other key element is they're typically the product of one collector. So
Hmm.
somebody owns them, and it could be and just think about this. I mean, just think, I mean, make yourself into like the heir of a kind of eccentric, wealthy, maybe noble person in what's now Germany. And your uncle he inherited all this stuff from, he's got like a narwhal tusk and a stuffed alligator and a couple of kind of dusty paintings and a few figurines from that they dug up, from like some Roman ruin nearby, and some things he acquired when he was traveling to Italy, and you've inherited all that stuff. It doesn't feel like you've gotten a boon. You're like, whoa, crazy Uncle
You never
Ludwig
know, though.
got.
There might be some goodies in there.
Yeah, yeah, there might be, but the whole thing is not what what I'm saying is that was shaped by the passion of the collector, and when he's out of the picture, some goodies might remain, and the rest might get tossed away. It depends on the desires, and collecting is its own thing. People who like to collect stuff, for example, odd stuffed creatures,
See,
they like.
so but the thing is that we're not hoarders, then we're collectors, we're curators of the human experience.
Well, I mean, the relationship between collecting and hoarding, to a certain extent, will be in the eye of the beholder. I mean, if you've ever, I mean, if you, where was I recently? I was in a small museum of Asian art in a small provincial town in Italy, and or maybe it was a large provincial town in Italy with where was that? I'm going to be less rude. It was actually Genoa. I was in Genoa, and you can call it whatever you want. It was a major city for a long time. It's not, but
Small provincial
it's not.
town.
Yes, I'm trying to remember. But the museums themselves there's a couple of very interesting museums of Asian art.
Mhm.
And one of them was made by some wealthy traveler who just I really can't quite remember the story. It's one of those rare things, a museum that's largely one person's collection. And it was created by this wealthy Genovese man traveling around. He was either traveling for business or as a diplomat, I can't remember. And what really struck me was, did you really need quite so many knives that are identical? He's got, just like a huge number of a certain kind of sword from Japan or knife from Bali, and a lot of them to the untrained eye look identical, right? So the collector and the hoarder are the kind of desire for more, the desire for completion, the unsatisfiable desire for completion. I'm, somewhat of a, I don't like to throw things out, but I don't have that urge myself, so I can't really explain it. But clearly, that is a particular thing that some people have. And I do think it's worth putting them in relationship from, between like, in the difference between a hoarder and a collector is vast, but some of their energies and psychic drives are related. And the only reason this is of interest is because that's very different from being a curator, right? A curator is someone who's trying to decide what should be displayed, and very often, I mean, if you get hired at a major museum or any kind of museum, you're basically in the position of that nephew I mentioned or niece who's just inherited from Uncle Ludwig. You've got all that stuff. But it's not just Uncle Ludwig's collection, it's Uncle Ludwig's collection and Aunt Sarah's collection, and then some stuff that someone just like dropped off. You don't know where it came from exactly, and you're putting it together into something, and that's what curating is. Anyway, I'm getting lost in my f the figures of speech here. I want to go back to the question of the museum that you asked about. So you really see the change between the kind of cabinet of curiosity and the modern museum taking place in the 19th century, right? And there's really no such thing as a classical museum. Museum simply means seat of the muses, places where the muses meet. So I guess you get to the heart of the issue there. What do you think will make muses gather? Right? And it's not obvious that the muses will gather where you put together lots of broken old things or old statues or old paintings, right? It's a cultural decision that so the muses, the goddesses or deities of various forms of inspiration, the muse of music, of history, of poetry, and so on. What's going to make them appear, right? You might think, well, I'm just going to have a brazier and burn some incense to them, and they'll appear that way, right? But no, it's a particularly modern idea that they're going to gather, that they're going to come help us out. We're going to be inspired when we put a lot of stuff together, right? So that the museum as as a place for inspiration is a particularly modern idea. I mean, there's collections of stuff. I mean, famously, uh, the Temple of Peace in Rome, paradoxically, it's called the Temple of Peace, was a place where they stashed lots of booty. Like so you might have put the relics from the Second Temple when the Romans sacked it, they would go there, things like that. But that's really just to go and look at how glorious your empire is. It's not really like you're then gonna become a great poet or you're gonna become a painter by looking at that stuff. It's in the 18th century, for example, just to go back to this from the art historical point of view, and it helps to make my point most simply about art. So the 18th century saw the rise of what we call neoclassicism. That's the idea that the best way to make important art or the art that's meaningful is by emulating the way that art was made in classical antiquity. So that meant that you had to go and look at the stuff. And of course, it's incredibly difficult to travel in the 18th century. The roads are very difficult. There's no trains, certainly, and there's various kind of conflicts and at various points. So, it's easier to collect the stuff in a way. It's not that easy, or to make casts of important statues and copy them. So, or prints. So casts and prints became very important. Many museums were actually originally made to house really significant cast collections, which we've gotten rid of because we don't believe that copies matter and so on. So neoclassicism was one of the big sources of energy for the creation of art museums. And that really, in ways that we don't believe in today, though maybe we should, um, was a direct connection between the muses and the museum. How do you make great art? By copying art from the past. How do you copy art from the past? By seeing it. So let us show it to you, right? So this idea was not present in the same way in earlier periods. Obviously, one of the things about the Renaissance is a new interest in classical art, but the amount of emulation that you get in the Renaissance is nothing compared to the direct imitation. I mean, if you look at a 18th century, late 18th century French painting, it's a game that art historians will do. They'll say that image there of like I don't know, Wolfe dying at the Battle of Quebec is I think that's where he died. I can't remember. That is actually based on the dying Gaul, right? So there's a statue of the dying Gaul at the Capitoline Museum in Rome. This artist studied it or probably studied a cast of it, copied it over the years. This is how you get a poignant, heroic dying figure. And so when need to paint a guy dying in the 18th century, you just copy that thing, right? So this is an example of why you would need museums of art in order to create creators. And in fact, this is like the 18th century. By the time you're getting to the middle years of the 19th century, it was a typical explanation of why you'd want a museum. In England, for example, was to um, everybody knew that England had the best factories, mills for making textiles, but everybody also knew that English design wasn't very good. So how do you make how do you profit from the fact that you've got the best mass production of textiles going, and you have a burgeoning empire. You're getting a lot of raw materials from elsewhere. You're getting raw materials often from the U.S. from stuff picked by enslaved people, and you could manufacture it in Manchester or elsewhere, and then you got huge markets. You could sell it to in India and elsewhere. So it's great. But you looking around, you can see the stuff made in India is way more beautiful than the stuff that you make. That's what, like cashmere shawls and things like that. Pashminas, remember the vogue for pashminas a few years ago? Like there's been an ongoing thing, fascination with Eastern textiles. But also France, they just French design is better. So how do they do it? How do we make our design better? Let's have museums for our artisans. So the emergence of the South Kensington Museum, which eventually became the Victoria and Albert Museum, is
Mhm.
based on that idea. So that's a kind of popularization of a movement that you're seeing in earlier periods in relation to what we call high art. You also see it in relation to design. But that's all kind of in a way practical. You also are seeing, as I mentioned at the beginning of answering this long answer to your question, I'm sorry, about the rise of the museum, you're also seeing the emergence of the idea of the public. And one of the challenges you have with the modern public is understanding who that public is and trying to figure out, and we still have this problem, how much does the public need to know in order to govern itself? What should it know in order to govern itself? Does it know enough? This is actually very much related to our earlier conversation about personal experience, personal judgment, and education, right? Who's to tell me what good government is? Who's to tell me what democracy is? Who's to tell me what it even says in my Constitution? So, I mean, it might say verbatim, if you're born here, you're a citizen, but I'm going to change that. So, in any case, um, the question of what a public is, what it knows, what it needs to know, and how it understands itself is a hugely pressing one today. And it certainly was what that after the French Revolution or in England during the period of growing democratization in the 19th century. It's one of the things that happened in the 19th century. You had various reform bills. If you look at England in the early 19th century, it's essentially a fairly corrupt oligarchy. There were sort of elections, but the elections were, well, for one thing, voting was not secret. A very small number of people could stand for office. Essentially, people would, you'd get the people who could vote who were obliged to, you get them drunk and take them to the polls and make sure they voted for whoever you wanted. Anyway, the franchise was very, very small. Very few people could vote. So what happens throughout the 19th century is an increase of the number of people voting. And you and I might think that's good, right? Because I hope we believe in democracy and that, people should choose their government. But as has become ever clearer lately, you haven't answered all the questions about what should happen when you say people should get the vote, right? I mean, so you get a big push for general education in the 19th century, is what I'm saying. And not coincidentally, the main gallery for the National Gallery was founded in the 1820s. So it was housed in the home of the guy who gave his collection, or more or less gave his collection to Britain for years. In the 1830s, they finally built a place for it in Trafalgar Square, where it still is,
Hmm.
the National Gallery. So when they were discussing where it should be, they put it there because that Trafalgar Square was seen as a place where various classes would meet. So they didn't put it in the fanciest parts of town, and they didn't put it in the poorest parts of town. They put it somewhere and this was the argument that Robert Peel made. We should put it here because it's where all our classes meet, and we need to make a kind of social harmony. He didn't say this, but now more than ever, because this is literally when they're arguing about the reform bill. The first reform bill, this is boring, Victorianist kind of stuff. The first reform bill did not do that much,
Hmm.
but the anxieties about it were real. I mean, because it was opening the door to something that was coming, and the conservative fear about what was coming was not wrong, right? The kind of power of the oligarchs that had run England for a very long time was was doomed by the process that the reform bills put into effect. I mean, it's only really been in the last, since Thatcher and so on, that they're moving backwards to, like us, to kind of just reestablishing oligarchies and plutocracies. But, you know, uh, the so the museum comes about in part because you need to imagine a concept of public education. I mean, the one thing I'm leaving out here is there's also a big evangelical push for general education because you want people to read the Bible and so on. But that, there's not that many museums that are founded because people want for religious purposes. There are some, but that's a different story. But so those are the two reasons why the museum is really a modern invention. It sounds old, and it's often full of old stuff. Most of the old stuff in the museum well predates the museum. And in fact, it was made by people who could have never imagined the museum.
That's an interesting point because I mean there are as you say small collections from antiquity, and we even have things like the Museum of Alexandria, but that was part of the Library of Alexandria, so there really wasn't a difference between those two things. And then the rest, as you say, are pretty much private collections. But
Well, and Michelle,
between,
let me interrupt you very briefly on that, just to say that that connection between museum and library was still operative until very late. So the
yes.
British Museum had the British Library. It only got pulled out. I mean, one of the things I discussed in the emergence of the modern museum is the growing specialization.
Mm.
If you look at that picture on that book that you have standing there, you see those animals there?
Yes.
Those are stuffed giraffes. Right? And that is the British Museum, where your viewers could go any day of the week. I mean, if they're in England, or most days, except when it's closed, but they could just go still to the British Museum. It's that same museum, and they will not see those giraffes there because, really very late, I believe it was in the 1880s, that the Museum of Natural History was open, and they moved all those collections. So, in a way, the British Museum still had a bit of a Wunderkammer vibe till quite late. And similarly, Karl Marx wrote, his major works at the British Museum, at the library there. So that relationship between museum and library is a real one, and it's a really interesting one. There's lots to be said about it.
Oh, absolutely. So between, as a last question, so between the British Museum, which was open to the public in 1759, and the Louvre, which is open to the public in 1793, so what relationship do those two major museums have to the other mu modern museums in the rest of the world?
Well, that you call that a last question? That's like my whole blasted career. So, um,
I know, but
I
we have
mean,
to give people something to read. They have to read the book. They have to
oh, I
know.
see. Well, I mean, I'm sure we've given them enough. If not, if we haven't already, then I'm not sure we can do more. But I could say a couple of things to start with. The British Museum was a museum, that was its name. You called it a public museum. Yes and
Mm,
no, right? When it was founded, or I mean, a lot of its holdings were books. They really were. There were a couple of major libraries and manuscript collections that were donated to the state, and that was like a basis of it. It also had a lot of natural history, which more and more as the period of imperial exploration and trade moved forward. It started to acquire the objects that we associated with it. Probably the most famous objects at the British museums for most of your viewers would be the Elgin marbles or the
hmm
Parthenon sculptures, and those only come in the early 19th century, right? If you go there, some of the other amazing stuff is the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone was acquired during the period of Napoleonic Wars, again, a 19th century acquisition. Unbelievable things to see there. The Assyrian statues that were acquired in the 1850s, right? So it's really you make the institution and you give the date for when it was founded, but really the museum always has a history and it develops. So a lot of the stuff that we makes the museum what it is, for example, it no longer has stuffed giraffes. But a lot of what makes it what it is still to come in 1859. But also, it was hardly a public museum. You couldn't enter it. You would have just like that. You had to write for permission to enter it.
mm.
And you got toured around by somebody. You couldn't just walk freely through it. So some of the key elements of a museum. I mean, I wish all museums were free, and they should be free. So maybe you have to pay. But a key characteristic of the modern museum is sort of free movement. And which is again related to the question of tours that you were talking about, right? You don't go to a museum to go on a tour typically. Sometimes you do, but typically you don't. You can go into that collection or that collection. You can stop at that art object or that art object. It's your call. It's a fairly, liberal concept. So, but that was not true of the British Museum. So I wouldn't call it exactly a public museum in 1859. 1759, when it opened. It's really the model of the Louvre that really reshapes everything. And people knew it. I mean, people from England rushed to see what they could see at the Louvre Museum, and it was hard because, of course, for decades England and France were at war, so it was very difficult.
Hmm.
But famously in the small world that I inhabit, there's a brief peace between France and England. Called the Peace of Amiens. So basically England essentially went to war with France after the Revolution, for various kind of political / dynastic reasons. And then, of course, Napoleon didn't help things, right? So there was, really from the 1780s to the 18 teens, the two nations were at war. And of course, the continent was riven by war and struggle during this period, especially around the Napoleonic period. But there's the Peace of Amiens in 1804 At that point, the Louvre is full of world masterpieces. The world's a smaller place in this period that the French have taken from various locations. The Louvre Museum is the greatest museum that has ever been, partly because there's much more consensus about what's important. So all these objects that you've only ever read about or heard about, these artists who you've heard about but never seen any of their works, you could just cross the channel, get a coach or walk and get to Paris, and you could spend months looking at these objects that would have been not visible before. So it was an extraordinary thing that the French did, and both things. And it was the king's collection. They had killed the king and made the collection public. That's an extraordinary thing. The collection of, and we deprecate and we're against looting and so forth, but the gathering of objects from all over Europe and bringing them to the Louvre at the time known as the Musée Napoléon is a terrible act of their war crimes to steal antiquities from places. But these objects, some of them, many of them were in either private collections or in churches or and this is in Europe in the early 19th century. There's no trains, there's no planes, there's no way to get to them. You suddenly had a museum where you could see everything, right? So while on the one hand it was a moral catastrophe that all the stuff was stolen, on the other hand, in terms of history and art history, it was an incredible boon. And the English people knew this. I've written about this period when the English started like looking at the stuff and like, damn, Napoleon's a bastard. I'm glad we're taking this whole stuff is going back, but geez, wait, the Prussians took that away already? I was still looking at it, because they pulled, people would go to the museums. I mean, talk about going back. People would go for weeks. They would, because this is like an incredible, So William Hazlitt, the great essayist who wanted to be a painter, he went repeatedly to, and also he was a real lefty, so he supported the revolution very much and Napoleon somewhat, and or quite a bit actually. And so he's just incredibly moved to see all these works of art, but they're being yanked away. But even reactionary people who hated Napoleon were having the same experience. They would go and look at it, go look, and then maybe the next day they don't go to the museum. They go for like a ride in the country, and they come back, and that Titian is gone. It's in Prussia now, or Austria, or maybe gone back to Italy even, right? By the way, this process of restitution was never completed.
Mm.
There's, I believe either half or more of the objects that Napoleon's people took were not returned for various reasons. They got distributed to provincial museums. They were not, I mean, the really famous ones, most of them went back. But um, uh, anyway, let me not get distracted by that. All I wanted to say was the radical nature of these museums, if you will, the Louvre as it was originally founded and the Musée Napoléon, really changed the culture of thinking about what a museum could be. And this kind of led to the sort of energies that we see in museums in later periods, for good and ill, right? The kind of desire for totality, to bring everything in there, maybe even other acts of looting. But also, on the other hand, the idea that the public deserves to have access to all these wonders and these incredible, better artists. Does that answer your question? I'm not sure it answered. It was a big question.
I know. Sorry, I left the biggest one for last, but the emergence of the modern museum and mythology of 19th century sources. If you can get it, please get it out by Oxford Press. And anything else that you could read by Jonah, I highly recommend it. Thank you so much for giving us so much of your time.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.